Welcome to my review of the book Console Wars. This is an important review of a very important book. If you're anything like me, you were around in the 90s for the ultimate debate, and that is Sega Genesis versus Super Nintendo. And this book not only tells the story of the actual console wars, but brings to life the people, places, and things behind the curtain. I actually read this book as an audiobook, and the presentation was fantastic. It was gripping all the way through. The book is definitely large, and it takes, a good amount of time to read, but it is definitely worth it. It is a fantastic book. It reads like a novel. Actually, I have a quote from the author. I spoke to him on the phone today, Blake J. Harris, and he said he wanted to write a book that his grandmother could read, a book about video games that even his grandmother could be interested in. And I think he's done a superb job, because my number one comment on this book was, it doesn't read like a non-fiction book at all. It reads like a novel. There's a definite protagonist. The book has a definite, I won't say bias, but a definite leaning towards the story of Sega, with Tom Kalinske and the Sega Genesis and Sega of America being the main protagonist, and Nintendo kind of being the obstacle to overcome on the way to Sega's success in the 90s. But before I really get into the review, and I'm going to get into a more in-depth review at the end of this video, so stick around for that. If you haven't subscribed already, click that subscribe button, click the notification button so that you'll be notified every time I put up a new video. Sit back, relax, grab a coffee, because I've done something pretty interesting today. Because there's such a debate, and there always has been such a debate since the 90s about Sega versus Nintendo, I wanted to bring in a few of my friends and fellow YouTubers to weigh in, and I asked them this question. In the 90s, were you Team Sega or Team Nintendo, and how did that affect your gaming choices going forward? So we're going to go right now to SmashJT and see how he stands on the issue. Smash?
What's going on, NerdCrave? Thank you so much for having me. It is SmashJT in my newly coming along game room, and you asked me a question regarding the 16-bit era and if it was Super Nintendo or Genesis that kind of shaped my gaming future. And while I did have both and I played both a lot, I would say by a long shot it was the Super Nintendo. And a lot of my games are I still have them with me. They're in this case that I mailed away for with Nintendo Power, and the specific games that really shaped my whole life was definitely Chrono Trigger, Secret of Mana, Final Fantasy III, which I found out later was Final Fantasy VI, Earthbound, role-playing games in general, Super Metroid as well. There's just Zelda, so many great memories from the 16-bit era. I still go back and play these today, and they still feel just as good as they were back then. Right now I'm playing Metroid Prime 2 Echoes, which is also a fantastic game, but these games I go back to all the time. Anyways, thank you so much for having me on, and you stay smashing.
Alright, next I'd like to welcome my friend Papa Pete, the old guy gamer. I've been watching every one of his videos over the last year or so since I discovered him. I've watched every single one of his videos, and he's somebody you should honestly follow. Let's see where he weighs in on this issue.
Hey guys, Papa Pete here, and I was asked by Aaron to come on and throw my hat into the ring and let you know about my pick as to whether or not back in the 90s I was Team Nintendo or Team Sega. And I have to say that it's kind of neat to get this question, because I really did have to make a conscientious decision back at that time, because it was around 92, 93, and I was looking to buy a new console, and I couldn't make up my mind whether I wanted to get a Super Nintendo or a Sega Genesis. And at the end of the day, one thing really swayed me in one direction or the other, and that is sports games. Back in those days, and really today too, some of my absolute favorite games of all time were sports games. I used to love playing hockey games, baseball games, basketball games, football games. One of my favorite games of all time is Tecmo Super Bowl. And what I was looking for is, I had lots of games, sports games on the NES, and I wanted to go to that next level. So all the articles that I had read they all said that the Sega Genesis did a better job with the sound and the actual playability with sports games. So for me, after reading a few of these articles, which were really pretty predominant at the time, I had no other decision but to go with Team Sega. So I picked up the Sega Genesis. How did it affect me later on? Well, I don't know if I continued there so much. Frankly, I went on to PlayStation was my next system. I didn't get the Saturn or the 32X. I didn't get any of those. I kind of wish I had them because I still have them today. I did get the Sega Dreamcast though, which I like very much. I did not have the GameCube back in the day. So I always sort of stayed with Team Sega, but I still always loved Nintendo at the same time. The bottom line was this. Back in 1993, finances sort of dictated exactly what you're going to get. If I could have had it all then, yeah, I would have loved to have had them both. Had everything I could get. But I had to pick and choose. And with the absolute best sports games available for home consoles at the time, the choice was clearly Team Sega. Take care, guys.
And now for another Pete. OEB Pete or Open Every Box. Pete, what have you got to say about Sega versus Nintendo?
Hey everybody, this is OEB Pete here from Open Every Box, and NerdCrave reached out to me and asked me a question I have not thought about in forever. I don't think I've ever thought about it. I'm not much into the console wars anytime, but the question was asked what I thought about, in the 16-bit generation of gaming, Nintendo and Sega. What was I, a Nintendo fanboy, I guess? Or was I on Team Nintendo, or was I on Team Sega? Well, I guess I was on no team. I was big into, at the time, that was in the 90s, so early 90s, late 80s, early 90s, so I was finishing high school and entering college. So perfect fanboy craziness, right? That's when you kind of, your opinions are maxed out on everything. But I didn't have a Sega Genesis. I had a Super Nintendo, and I wasn't a fanboy because I used to read GamePro magazine, Electronic Gaming Monthly magazine, those things, and I'd look at all the games. And it's not that I didn't like the Genesis, I just didn't have one. My ecosystem was the Super Nintendo because I had owned an NES. But I played the Genesis a lot at friends and family's house, so I have a great appreciation for them. So, but the fact that I was in the Nintendo ecosystem, because that's what I got for gifts and presents and stuff, I guess I have this special nostalgia for Nintendo and Nintendo products. And some of my favorite memories ever of gaming is the NES and the Super Nintendo. Playing games like NHL 93, RBI Baseball on the NES, Temco Tecmo Super Football, all those games. I absolutely love them. So they shaped me as a gamer and as an adult because I just love the family-friendly nature of those games. I love the positive nature of most Nintendo games. Sega took risks, and I really appreciate them for that. And I've become a much bigger fan of Sega as I've gotten older and more mature as a gamer through my, my late teens, 20s, 30s, and now 40s. But I still love Nintendo. So I guess you could say I'm Team Nintendo, but I'm not exclusive to Nintendo. I love Sony, I love Sega, I love them all. And what I do appreciate from Nintendo is my children are playing it today, and they're going back and playing the old retro games that I play and are enjoying it, and we're still making wonderful memories. So there you have it. I guess I am a Nintendo guy, but I absolutely love Sega and Sony equally. So the 16-bit, I think, the 8-bit to 16-bit generations is the greatest generation in gaming, in my opinion. Just because of the games, the creativity, the graphics, and the fact of where I was at in my life. Well, there you go. And thank you so much, NerdCrave, for having me on. I love your channel, and you have an awesome day, okay?
Thanks, Pete. Keep opening those boxes. All right, our next guest is PK in the Universe. Paul, take it away.
During the 16-bit era, I was very much pro Nintendo, honestly, and I still love Nintendo as a company and I love the systems they make. There's never been a time where I didn't buy a Nintendo home console when it was current, So, in fact, my very first video game console I ever bought with my own money was the Super NES. Ironically enough, though, the very first 16-bit console I ever played was the Sega Genesis. I actually played it at a babysitter's house, and they had Sonic 2, and that was my first experience in the 16-bit era. And yeah, but it was something about Nintendo, honestly. In fact, Super Mario RPG is my favorite game of all time, and it's of course on the Super NES, so naturally I gravitate even more so to the Super NES. In the modern era, of course, of playing video games, especially I love playing games on the Switch, I find myself playing my Sega Genesis collection on the Switch more than I do the Super NES online, actually. So it's interesting how I missed out so much on the Sega Genesis. I still find myself wanting to explore that library more so than the Super Nintendo, just because of how much I played it. And so that's how that's affected my gaming habits at this point in my life. So that's what I think about that.
As you can see, almost 30 years later, there's no shortage of differing opinions on who won the console wars. Let's take it to our last guest, Retro Tony, and see where he stands.
How's it going? Tony here. Aaron asked me a very important question. During the 16-bit era, was I Team Sega Genesis or was I Team Super Nintendo? Well, in all reality, I did have a Super Nintendo as a kid and a Sega Genesis. So I was a little bit of both. Now the Sega Genesis though, this was my console. This was my very first console. I didn't have to share this with my brother. I didn't have to share it with anyone else. It was my console, playing Sonic the Hedgehog 2, Shining Force 1, Shining Force 2, Phantasy Star 4, etc. But I still adored and loved the Super Nintendo. There were so many great games on this. Chrono Trigger, Earthbound, Final Fantasy 2/4, Final Fantasy 3/6, Super Mario World, Super Metroid, Super Punch-Out, just to name a few. So I loved both. So how did this affect me going forward as a gamer? Now I still love the Super Nintendo. I actually would borrow games from friends, I would rent games, and I'd still get games for birthdays, Christmases, etc. But I spent the majority of my money on Sega Genesis games. I have fond memories of saving up my allowance money, birthday money, paper route money to buy great games like Sonic and Knuckles and Turtles Hyperstone Heist. Man, I spent a lot of money on Sega Genesis games back in the day, but you got to consider I was between the ages of 10 to 12 years old. So I have an affinity for both. I love both, and I still collect for both systems to this day.
Alright, thanks guys. So that really shows you the variety of opinions from the 16-bit era. Was it Sega Genesis? Was it Super Nintendo? Or were you like me, the odd guy on the corner that had a TurboGrafx 16? And I fought just as hard as everybody else to say that my system was the best one, and I still think to this day the TurboGrafx 16 was fantastic, but nobody talks about it, and frankly, there was barely even a reference to the TurboGrafx in here. He did mention it. This book is the most insanely detailed account of the 16-bit console wars that I've ever seen. The gaming historian, a YouTuber that I really respect, I think his content is really credible and well-researched, he did a review on this book, and he said that there are a lot of things in this book that even he did not know about, and he was pretty impressed. When I interviewed the author, Blake J. Harris, he says he conducted over 200 interviews in addition to gathering thousands of documents and video clips. He further claims that over the 3-year process of writing this book, he was, for much of it, in nearly daily contact with several of the key players in the story. The book covers a 6-year period from the hiring of Tom Kalinske as Sega of America's president in 1990 and follows his career there as he positions the Sega Genesis to dominate the video game landscape. When he was hired, Sega had less than 10% of the video game market share, and by the time he left in 1996, Sega had captured about 55% of the video game market. The book also goes into great detail about the personalities behind the curtain that eventually killed Sega's hopes for lasting success. Sega of Japan seemed to get jealous of Tom's success in America and began making some very strange decisions that ultimately led to failures like the 32X and the Saturn. My biggest takeaway from this book was the depth of character development. From the first few pages, the reader begins to get invested in the key players, and you begin to root for the underdog. This is really an underdog makes good sort of story, and the author, Mr. Harris, does a great job of creating characters that you care about. You want them to succeed. I was actually so blown away by the character development that I began to doubt its authenticity. There are so many scenes and details in the book that made me wonder, how could anyone get such information from something that happened almost 30 years ago? I actually reached out to the author, and I was honored to speak with him on the phone in New York City for almost an hour. In the course of that interview, I asked him about this. He said that over the course of 3 years of being in almost constant contact with many of the major players in the story, he was able to build a pretty good profile of the characters involved, but that of course he had taken some liberties with things like dialogue to flesh out the characters and move the story along. However, he believes that the context and intent of those liberties are very much in keeping with what the actual setting would have been. This book has been so well received that it has been made into a documentary, and a major motion picture is also in the works. So if you're not a big reader, you will be able to connect in those ways coming soon, but I would definitely recommend the audiobook if you don't like reading. The narrator does a great job of bringing the characters to life and keeping the pace of the book interesting and exciting. Whichever version you choose, this story deserves your attention. The 16-bit generation has so many firsts, from the first global launch of a game to the first game rating board. This is a very important part of gaming history, and without a doubt, this is the best way to learn about it. Alright guys, so let me know in the comments, were you Team Sega Genesis? Were you Team Super Nintendo? Or were you maybe the weird guy like me that was Team TurboGrafx-16? Let me know down in the comments. And I want to thank the guys that contributed to this video. It really means a lot to me that people were interested in this concept and wanted to contribute, so thank you to SmashJT, thank you to OEB Pete, thank you to Papa Pete, thank you to PK in the Universe, thank you to Retro Tony. Guys, it was great to have you on the channel, and thank you to Blake J. Harris for taking the time to have a long conversation with me and really fill me in on his backstory in terms of how he wrote this book. So guys, if you haven't subscribed already, go ahead and subscribe because we're putting up content like this all the time. Hit that little notification bell so that you'll be notified every time I put up a new video. And go ahead and like this video if you liked it because it lets me know whether this is the type of videos that you want to see in the future. Thanks so much guys, stay classy.